sympathetic for Scott Derrickson because, you know, he mentions, especially in early interviews about the time of Exorcism of Emily Rose or Deliver Us from Evil or even Sinister, he mentions in early interviews he's a lot more forthcoming about those kind of things than when he broke into with Doctor Strange and became a much more talked about and prominent figure in the larger sort of Hollywood scene. So yeah, I sympathize with the burden that must be to bear the weight of people's expectations of what you believe,
right,
on top of actually having to parse out how you really feel about everything, which is not easy in itself.
Definitely. Well, and there's actually there's a moment from the film that kind of ties right into all of that. It's when he's talking to the Ancient One and, you know, saying that this, you know, I have to surrender control to gain control. That doesn't make sense.
Right.
And she tells him, not everything does, and not everything has to. And that's a sort of ambiguity that many Christians are really uncomfortable with.
Oh, absolutely.
And so, and, you know, when we talk about, you know, I'm a Christian, you know, I think, you know, for better or worse, especially in evangelical circles, we have this sort of whole array of expectations then of like, well, if you're a real Christian, then obviously means that you believe this and this and this and this, just like me. And
right. Oh man.
And the older I get, and, you know, I'm not a really old guy, of course, by any means, but
two old fogies talking about Doctor Strange.
That's right. I think the more mature I become in my faith, the more I realize that there are definitely like core things into which no single bit of compromise needs to be introduced.
Right.
And those are pretty obvious. But there's a lot of other stuff that really does not need to be the hill that we die on.
Absolutely.
And it's really sad, you know, to see how much discord there can be in the Christian community over stuff that is, you know, it's not unimportant, but is definitely not, you know, an essential element of our faith. And
yeah.
And I mentioned this, you know, quite a few episodes ago now. You know, I'm afraid that this is a movie that could be dismissed just out of hand by a lot of sort of more fundamentalist, you know, Christians, just in saying, oh, well, that's all about magic. You know, we shouldn't have anything to do with that. And that's not what it's about. This movie is not about magic. It's about the journey of a man who is taken down to his lowest point and realizes that the universe is bigger than himself. And
yes.
And obviously, you know, that's a vague enough idea that almost anyone could find something to latch onto there. But especially as Christians, we have there's a lot that we can, you know, grab onto in that kind of story as well.
Certainly. I apologize if I'm interrupting a sort of train of thought here, but I want to tag back to what you said. I had to, listeners, I'll just be confessional that I had to Google this to make sure that I was not going to sound like an idiot. But I thought it was, and then this confirmed it. But St. Augustine had said, is famously quoted as saying, in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, liberty, and in all things, love. So, and I think that's a good gauge for like what you were talking about, where you say like there are some fundamental things that we need to kind of agree on. And what I usually say to people who are sort of exploring things is I say there are certain lines that when you get to those lines, you're simply not addressing Christianity anymore. This doesn't mean that what you're addressing is not necessarily also true. And I know I just scandalized a whole cloth of people by even saying that. But at a certain point, you reach a place to where the idea that you're extrapolating is not necessarily explicitly Christian anymore, that it's not exclusive to Christianity or is not a tenet of the Christian faith. And I think when you extend into those boundaries, there are certain things that we all have to, as brothers and sisters in Christ, we have to come to an agreement of the liberty portion of that conversation, and we've got to allow people the freedom and the flexibility to be able to sort of understand. One of the things that's been very helpful to me, and then I'll bring it back in very deliberately into Dr. Strange. One of the things that's been very helpful is the best word that I can come up with for me is to use Paul's analogy of the body.
Yeah.
When he talked about the body in conversation about calling and in conversation about purpose and intention, but I have found it to be a helpful metaphor really unilaterally for myself, because you think about this, if you think about the fact that your body is made up of so many different distinct parts, but also with distinct sensitivities and distinct focal points, like my eye is very concerned with what I see and with engaging and navigating the world around me. But then you have some people who have no use of their eye and they navigate through other means. And then there's certain things in your body that you don't think about that are automatic. Like if I eat lunch, I'm not actively thinking about my body's digestion, even though it is constantly at work within me. And then there are other things at which I have to be very conscious about, like if I'm, threading a needle or something like that, then I'm very attuned to those parts of my body. And I think if we look at this in the broader spectrum of the Christian faith, there are going to be things that we can kind of take as automatic, and there are going to be things that we can take as very intentional. There are going to be things that we can take as needing more sensitivity and things that maybe need less sensitivity. But also, and this is where I'll bring it into Doctor Strange, to me, it's very much, I don't disagree with what you said about, Strange's personal journey, but it's also very much about broadening perspective, about seeing sort of above. One of my favorite passages of Scripture is in the opening chapter of Revelation when basically God says to John, okay, come up here. Right. So see things from this different perspective. See, I love Tilda Swinton's character's line, which said, you're going to find that I am embarrassingly bad with the names of these characters, but I'll remember the actors. But so Tilda Swinton's character's name, when she says to him, all your life you've been trying to widen the keyhole. You've been looking through the keyhole. And I thought, what a perfect analogy that is, of trying to ascertain what's on the other side of this door by only looking through the keyhole. And that's not a new idea or expression in Christian faith. There's many countless writers who have talked about sort of a heavenly perspective is that, well, now the door is gone, and now you've just walked into the room, so now you can take the lay of the room. And to me, that's really, speaking to the magic comment that you referenced earlier, that's really what I find anybody who would say, like, oh, it's just about magic. I was like, listen, guys, to a certain point of view, our faith is magic. I mean, yes, we believe in the substantiation of Jesus Christ coming. We believe in incarnational theology. We believe in the death, burial, and resurrection. But to a non-believer, that sounds like magic. I mean, that's what that sounds like, And so I think that's really what, if you're trying to sort of ascertain some of the thematic elements of what the film, I think, is scratching at, is it's at substantiating how to operate within something that would otherwise be very mysterious. And it doesn't mean that it's not mysterious or even less mysterious in that you can operate in it. You just know now, and so you're able to operate in it, which I find powerful.
Yeah, that whole idea of widening your perspective, it is another one of the themes of this movie, especially in the beginning in terms of Strange's journey, is this clash of worldviews, right? You have the hard scientism of when he says, you're nothing, you're a tiny momentary speck in an indifferent universe.
Oh, right.
And she says, you think too little of yourself, and that's I think that's such a great interchange there. And it's a great articulation of the difference in a purely materialistic or scientistic perspective versus what we as believers have in our worldview of knowing that there is a higher reality, beyond what we can see. And we don't Because if you take that pure materialism to its logical conclusion, there is no meaning to anything. And the philosophers who are really consistent about their worldview will totally bite that bullet. Dawkins says, we're just here. We're just, it's all about the genes. Nothing matters.
Right.
There is no meaning to anything. The only reason we're here is because these things inside of us want there to be more of them.
Right.
And
As if
that's,
it was pure mechanics.
And that's it. Yeah, it's not about anything. There's no meaning to anything. We're just here because of this blind biological process. And so if you apply that, to its logical conclusion, like there's no reason for me to be, kind to you unless it suits my purposes to do so.
Exactly.
Unless there's something in it for me, there's no reason for me to do anything other than that which just pleases myself. And actually, I totally unintentionally came back around to where we find Stephen Strange at the beginning of this movie. He does nothing except that which serves his own glory.
Absolutely. To the degree that even when right before his accident, he's passing down chances to look at something because of this, this record that he has.
Yeah.
And so he's like, oh yeah, that's not, which again, that calls back to kind of the Sherlock character, but it's like, yeah, that's not interesting to me. That's not worth my time. It's only if it's going to serve the furtherance of his sort of legacy, as it were, that he'll give it any degree of attention.
Yep. And I'm glad you mentioned that scene because just real quick, I know that, and I thought this too when I first saw the film. There's a mention of a Marine colonel with an experimental suit of armor who has a spine injury, and a lot of people thought that refers to James Rhodes in Civil War, but it in fact does not.
Was that the is that Panghorn that he's talking about?
No, he's not talking about Pangborn either, because Pangborn was just some other guy. I can't remember what his career was. It's been speculated that may actually be a reference to, if you remember back to Iron Man 2, when Tony steals the screens and shows what was actually happening with the experimental armor, and you had one guy actually twist himself all the way around.
Right.
There's a speculation that it might be actually referring to that, which actually helps the timeline here to work a little bit better. Because if that is supposed to talk about Civil War, like there's no time for Stephen to become a master of the mystic arts.
That's exactly right.
But if you go back, like 6 years, then all of a sudden we're talking about a slightly more reasonable time frame for him to acquire all of this knowledge.
Yeah, you're right. I'm going to go ahead and adopt that theory. Yeah, I think you've convinced me.
Headcanon. Yep. Yeah, and actually, it was I saw somebody who had actually been on Twitter with Scott Derrickson, and he explicitly said, "No, that's not Rhodes. He's not talking about Rhodes there."
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So there's a trivial bit, to use parlance from Fear of God.
Yeah, and I love that about the MCU at large. Like, one of the things that's been really fun about watching these films progress is the layer of complexity of interconnectedness of how they are. We've had shared universes before in cinema, but never to this degree, never to this capacity, where there's actually, like, they're actively interacting with one another, and it's so great.
Well, when we're all finished with this after Infinity War, I hope that Tyler and I can do an episode, just sort of a retrospective on what this experiment of this vast interconnected cinematic universe, has going for it, and how do we compare that with other things, and how is it going to be, how is everything, all other attempts at this kind of thing going to be compared to the MCU moving forward. And I'm hoping he can lend some perspective on the whole cinematic aspect of that, because
sure.
But And you mentioned, that there's a lot of fun to be had in the MCU with these connections, and I think,
Sure.
and I've said this before, that like that is one of the reasons I think that people keep coming back to